All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Start by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dov Yomi and Elman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a bas mitzvah. May she continue to be a source of nachas for the entire mishpacha. We also thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Pearl Katz and Fagi Friedman, in honor of the 95th birthday of their dearest mother, Malka Meisner, Malka Bas Perel on the 6th of Teves, their aunt, Blima Bas Perel on her 92nd birthday, Yudale Teves, and appreciation of all of the shiurim. Incredible. Neva Esem Shanim Tovos. We also thank Bani Pesachim for dedicating today's Day of Learning with appreciation to Hashem as she begins her 41st year as a nurse and her sixth year in Baltimore. We wish Bani much continued Hatzlacha and Simcha ad Neva Esem Shanim Tovos. All right, boss, with that, let us begin. Such beautiful dedications. Good way to start the morning. So I'll say today's daf is Lamed Tes 39, and we are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on the top of the daf. So today we begin a really incredible sugya. I just sent out on the WhatsApp chat just a PDF with 2 pages of Shulchan Aruch that I hope Emir Hashem we will get to at the end of the shir. You'll see why I'm mentioning that now. So it says the Mishnah, Ve'elu yirakos sha'adam yotzei b'han yedei chavasa b'Pesach. So we'll say, remember again, Maror really needs no introduction, right? The halach is the Torah tells us, amatzos umerorim yochluhu. When describing the Karban Pesach, the Torah tells us that halacha l'maisa, one has to eat the Karban Pesach ultimately with matzah and maror. Matzah and maror. So remember again, maror itself, although we consume maror independently, maror itself is really a function of Karban Pesach, which is why today, in the absence of Karban Pesach, maror is d'Rabbanan, as we will discuss. But in any event, the Mishnah says, these are the vegetables. Sha'adam yotzei b'han yedei chavasa b'Pesach. What are the vegetables? Bechazeres. Again, we'll translate some of these items in the Gemara. Others, Emir Hashem, will actually translate when we get towards the Mishnah Berurah a bit more. So bechazeres, betamcha, becharchavina, beulshin, ubimoror. Okay, so like I said, we'll define the types in a bit. So the Gemara says, Yotzein bahen, bein lachin, bein yeveshin. You could use these items for maror, whether they're moist or whether they are dry. Avalo kivushin, but you can't go ahead and kavush rabosai literally means in chulin. Generally, what it means is pickled. Pickled, so it means but it means you've pickled it to preserve it. So you can't go ahead and use it in a preserved state. Velo shalukin, you can't use it in a cooked state. Velo muvushalan. I should say shlukin really means soaked, and muvushalan means cooked. So the idea that the Mishnah teaching me is that halacha l'maisa, I could use any part of the plant. It would appear, right? I could go ahead and use the stalks. I could use the leaves. But halacha l'maisa, it must be in a raw state. Can't be in a cooked state. Good. Umitztarfin l'kizayis. And ultimately, again, you could use different forms of maror and have them together to combine into a kizayis. So, both say, technically speaking, you could use maror that is made of a number of different species. It's not charged. Of a number of different species, and they could combine together ultimately to form one kizayis of maror. Interesting halacha. The yotzin bekevach shalahen. You could use the stalk of these plants. Ubidimai. Or you can use maror of dimai and maror of maiserishon shenitla trumasa. So we'll say just like we had by matzah, you could use ultimately again maiserishon whose truma was taken, or maiser sheni vehekdish sheniftu. And similarly again, you could use the maror of maiser sheni or of hekdish which were redeemed. Good. So we'll say those are the halachos of maror. Now the Gemara is going to spend a few moments trying to go ahead and explain some of the halachos espoused in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara. So we'll say first, let's start with some definitions. So chazeres, what is chazeres? Chasa. It's chasa. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, again, we'll see Let me give you a little bit of, give you a little bit of coming attractions. When we get to the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah is going to point out we actually don't know what a lot of these things are. All we know, however, is that they are quote-unquote bitter tasting plants. Now, when I say bitter, I'm also putting that in quotation marks because we're going to see that maror doesn't necessarily have to be bitter. It may just be that it has to be tasteless. So again, we'll get into this in just a little bit. We'll define wherever we could define. So the Gemara says, excuse me. So the Gemara says that chazeres is chasa. So Rashi says over here, Rashi says chasa litugna, which takes us then to the Hagos Tzionim in letter Gimel. B'lashon Ashkenaz salat, right? Lettuce. So bepashtos, according to most opinions, we're going to see that chazeres is going to be lettuce. Now, what I want to point out, and this is where it just gets a little bit confusing, we're going to see that a little bit later on in the Mishnah Berurah, he actually uses the word chazeres to refer to something else, and chasa to refer to lettuce, which is like more modern Hebrew. So again, we'll discuss. We'll see all of the halachos or the halacha l'mayis, I should say. But for now, chazeres is chasa. Chazeres is chasa. So chazeres is lettuce. Ulshin hindivi. Ulshin is often translated as endives. So the Gemara says tamcha. Amar Rabba bar Rachana tamchasa shma. Its name is tamchasa. Charchavina Amar Shimon Lakish. Atzvasa de dikla. It's the vine that wraps around the palm tree. Uvemaror mirarisa. And maror ultimately again is this plant called mirarisa. Okay, so we'll say these were all different bitter types of tasting plants in the times of the Gemara. Tani bar Kafra. These are the vegetables with which one could fulfill their obligation of maror on Pesach. Bolshin, ubetamcha, ubechardelin, ubecharchavinin, ubechazarin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af ul sheisada, v'ul shegina, chazeres ul shegina. So the Gemara says, fine. So the Gemara says, v'chazeres. So hatar l'reisha. But one second, interesting enough, Rabbi say, what the Gemara picks up with Rabbi Yehuda is that although Rabbi Yehuda mentions many different types of items, his order is a little bit different. See, Rabbi say, we're assuming over here now let's discuss. The Mishnah gives us an order of vegetables to be used for maror. The shaila is how to interpret that particular list. Is the list meant to create a priority and a hierarchy, or is the list ultimately there just to be a list? But lav dafka, that the order of the list is specific. So the Gemara is making the assumption here that the order of the list is specific as well. And therefore, for example, the fact that the Mishnah puts chazeres, puts lettuce first, indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, lettuce is the preferred item for maror. Yet, when Rabbi Yehuda comes along and discusses his list, he doesn't have chazeres at the top. So the Gemara says, Hatani l'reisha, but our Mishnah puts chazeres number one. Hachi kamar, this is what it means to say, af ul she sadek ul shegina v'chazeres. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda means to say that halacha l'maisa, ul she sadan, ul shegina will be just like chazeres is usable and preferred, so too these items are usable as well. Rabbi Meir Omer, af asvas v'tura umar yeruar. So Rabbi Meir adds more bitter vegetables onto the list. Amr Rabbi Yossi, asvas v'tura echatu. We'll say first wide line, lamentasim with aleph. Rabbi Yossi says asvas and tura are the same thing. Umar, the Gemara says umar zehu yeruar, and mar itself is yeruar. Okay. Turn to Rabbi Shmuel, Elu Yerakus, Shadam Yotze B'han Yedei Chavasa B'Pesach. These are the vegetables that one could use ultimately again to fulfill their obligation of maror on Pesach. Bechazeres, Be'ulshin, Ubetamcha, Ubecharchavinin, Ubecharginin, Ubehardufnin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Av Chazeres Yulin, V'Chazeres Golin, Ki Yotze B'hem. So we'll say, all you have over here is each of these opinions adding on more bitter vegetables. Rabbi Eli Mishum, Rabbi Eli Amar Mishum, Rabbi Eliezer, Af Ar Kabolim. Our Kabbalim are also included in this discussion. But ultimately, again, I went and I saw Rabbi Eloi says over from the Rabbi Eliezer. I should say Rabbi Eloi says this over in the name of Rabbi Eliezer. And the ultimate Rashi says over here that this Arka Bolim is Siv Godol Va'av Umini Atzmahu. It's some type of bast that's very thick, a species unto itself. So Rabbi Eloi says, I said this over in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that Arka Bolim could be used for muktzah, but I haven't found anyone who has corroborated. Ubikashti li chaver, I wanted to find a friend to corroborate my statement of Halom Atzasi, but I've been unable to do so. Ukisha basifni Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, but when I came before Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, hoda lidvarai, he agreed with my version of things. Rabbi Huda says, which means Akabalim would be usable. Rabbi Huda Omer Kolshi Yeshbo Srafs. Well, so this is very interesting. Rabbi Huda comes along, and what Rabbi Huda does is try to move away a little bit from specific items and focus a bit more on qualities, which is interesting. In other words, if we can go ahead and kind of establish that halacha l'maisa, any item which possesses these particular qualities will ultimately, again, can be used for maror. So, for example, Rabbi Huda says, "Kol sheyesh lo sraf," any plant that has some type of sap. Rashi says over here, sraf. It's Rashi a little bit further up in the shorter lines. Rashi says sraf. He explains. Kishesochtin also b'makom chitucho yotze mimenu sraf lavan kichalav v'korin litun. So Rashi says that any plant that possesses, where you cut it, that when you squeeze the area, ultimately again some white-like sap substance comes out, that's usable for maror. Now he's not saying the substance is usable for maror. He's saying that is a siman of the type of plant which can be used for maror, the type of vegetable which can be used for maror. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Kol shepanav machsifin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says any plant or any vegetable that has a pale appearance is suitable for maror. Rashi says machsifin, Eino Yorok Ma'od Kikarsi Ela Paldish. It's not exceptionally green or not a very dark green, but rather a lighter, paler green. That will be usable ultimately for maror. Achirim Omrim, the Achirim say, Kol Yerek Mar Yesh Lo Sraf Upanav Machsifin. The Achirim say that the truth is, really no one's arguing. Any bitter plant, any truly bitter vegetable possesses both sap as well as a pale external look. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says that according to the Achirim, if it has sap and a pale appearance, then halacha l'maisa is usable for maror. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, medivrei kulan nilmad. From all of them, we could learn yerek mar yesh lo sraf upanav machsifin. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yochanan says that from all of them, we see that a bitter vegetable possesses these qualities. A, it has a sap. B, it has a pale appearance. Amar Rav Huna, halacha k'achirim. And Rav Huna says the halacha follows the achirim. Okay. Ravina, we'll see halacha l'maisa how we paskin. Ravina ashkechel ravacha breid rava dahava mahader amiri rasa. So we'll say Ravina found Ravacha breid rava, and Ravina breid rava. Ravacha breid rava ultimately again was searching for mirarisa. Now also remember again, mirarisa was the name of a vegetable. So he was searching out mirarisa for use as maror. Amar lei, so Ravina says to Ravacha, "My daitech, why are you dafka searching for mirarisa? Why? Are you assuming because the mirarisa is especially bitter, that's why you're using it? I v'hol chazeres tinan." But halacha l'maisa, the first item that the Mishnah quoted, or the Mishnah stated, was chazeres. And the fact that that is the first item mentioned in the Mishnah indicates to us what? That is the preferred item for maror. So if that's the preferred item for maror, why is it that you are looking for other things? V'tana debei Rabbi Shmuel. Sorry, V'tana de Shmuel, Chazaras. And ultimately, again, in the yeshiva of Shmuel, they said the preferred maror is Chazaras. V'amar Rabbi Oshia said, Mitzvah bechazaras. It is ideal to use lettuce. That is the ideal, to use lettuce for maror. So the Gemara says, V'amar Rava, my Chazaras, what is Chazaras? Chasa. Right? What is Chazaras? Chazaras is chasa. Chasa is lettuce. So we'll say, why is lettuce preferred for maror? So now the Gemara asks this shaila, what is it? What are the qualities about lettuce that ultimately again make it the preferred maror of use? So the Gemara says, my chasa. Why is its name chasa? The chas rachmana ilovin. Ultimately, again, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have compassion upon us. Look at Rashi, my chasa. This is Rashi right across. My time karina lechasa mishum dezecher hu dechas rachmana alan. Shabo says, so this is very interesting. Lav dafka, that this is the reason why chasa is named chasa, but ultimately, again, Chazal see an allusion. They see a connection in the name of lettuce itself, of this type of maror itself, to the Pesach experience. Pesach is all about the geula of Klal Yisrael, from the mariros, from the bitterness of our circumstances. Chasa, to chas, means to have compassion. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, we like chasa. Why? Number one, because the name itself reflects the salvational identity of these days. Techas rachmana ilovin, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have compassion upon us. Why is it that the Egyptian experience, the servitude experience, Shibud Mitzrayim, is likened to mar? Just like maror, especially if you are using chasa, especially if you're using lettuce. Just like maror itself, tchila sorach, ultimately, again, the beginning of it is soft, v'sofo kasha. But I will say, interestingly enough, the big shaila with lettuce isn't bitter. Lettuce isn't bitter. And again, I will say, we'll see, mentioned in the Mishnah Berurah, there's an interesting machlokas aposkim as to which type of lettuce the Mishnah is referring to. It's often assumed that it's romaine lettuce. But the truth is, there are many poskim that bring down that all varieties of lettuce, including iceberg lettuce, is 100% usable for maror. In fact, I will say many poskim actually prefer the use of iceberg lettuce to romaine lettuce for use as maror, for the simple reason that romaine lettuce has significant bug issues. So if you go ahead and you buy bodeg lettuce, you buy check lettuce, fine. But halacha l'maisa, it's much easier to check iceberg lettuce than it is to check romaine lettuce. And certainly, again, remember, we've seen this already a number of times, the consumption of maror is derabanan. There are 8 lavim associated with the consumption of shratzim, with the consumption of bugs. So to fulfill a mitzvah derabanan while violating 8 prohibitions does not seem to be a very good return on investment. So just pointing out, although again it would appear that there are still many poskim who favor romaine lettuce, we begin to see from this Gemara, it's not a din in bitterness. Because really what the Gemara is asking, in general, lettuce isn't bitter. So why is lettuce suitable for maror? Because lettuce, interestingly enough, reflects the actual nature of the shibud experience. What was the shibud experience? It began soft. Tchila sorach. Rashi points out over here, Tchila soraka, betchila nishtabdu lahen al yidei schar, shayu sochrin osan. Both say in the beginning, ultimately, again, it's true we had to work for the Egyptians, but we were paid for that work. So because we were paid, ultimately, again, it was still quote-unquote shibud, it was still forced labor, but lamaisa, we were paid. And then at the end, sofo kasha. At the end, ultimately, again, the slavery becomes very bitter and difficult. So that's reflected in the dynamic of lettuce maturation. In the beginning, the head of lettuce is soft. Leave it in the ground too long, and what happens? Everything hardens. So we'll say, so this is really incredibly interesting, because halacha l'maaseh, it turns out that the reason Chazal put lettuce at the top of the list of maror was really for 2 reasons. Number one, because of the name, chasa, Chasa, the name itself represents, our aspirational wish that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have compassion and redeem us. That's Aleph, so we like the name. And number two, the actual lettuce maturation is very much reflective of the entire Egyptian experience. Tchilaso rak, in the beginning it was soft, manageable, even at times enjoyable, the sofa kasha, but then it became exceptionally unbearable, difficult, and very hard. So really, really incredible. Amrlei Hadribi. So supposed to say, isn't this? Remember, this whole thing started because Ravina found Rav Acha looking for Mirarisa. And he said to Rav Acha, why are you looking for Mirarisa? Chazal wants you to use Chazares. To which Rav Acha said, you're right. Hadribi, I retract. I'm not looking for Mirarisa anymore. Now I'm looking for lettuce. Good. Amrlei Rav Rechumi La'abaye. Mimai dahai maror min yaraku. How do you know that maror is a type of vegetable? So the Gemara says, maybe, ema mirarisa de kufya. Maybe I will say it's mirarisa de kufya. Look at Rashi. Mirarisa de kufya, mara shel dag sheshmo kain. Maybe it's literally mirarisa also means like the gall, right? Maybe it's from the juice, the bitter juice of this fish, mirarisa de kufya, the gall of this kufya fish. To which the Gemara says, dumya de matzah. Because remember, again, matzah and maror are linked. And therefore, maror must be like matzah. Ma matzah gidulei karka, mar gidulei karka. So remember, again, everything is mentioned together. Amasos umirorim yochluhu. So therefore, again, maror is linked to matzah. Just like matzah has to be made from something that grows from the ground, so too maror must come from something that grows from the ground. I ve'ema hirduf. Maybe ultimately, again, you should use hirduf. I will say, now what's hirduf? If you look at Rashi, this is incredible. Rashi says, hirduf, eitz shehimtik bo Moshes mei mara, va'aminan nes besochnes shehu hayamar, v'hu hirduf. We'll say, Klal Yisrael's first stop after crossing the Yam Suf was a place called Mara. So the Torah says that Klal Yisrael were unable to drink the waters of Mara, ki marim heim, for they were bitter. So the Torah said, vayashlichei of eitz. Moshe Rabbeinu put a tree into the water, and miraculously again the water became sweet. So the Gemara is identifying that tree that Moshe Rabbeinu used was a hirduf tree. Now the miracle was the hirduf tree itself is bitter. So Moshe used something bitter to make another item which was bitter, sweet. So maybe it's hirduf. To which the Gemara says, no, dumya de matzah. Ma matzah min zraim, af mar min zraim. No, because just like matzah, because we'll say again, mar has to be like matzah. And just like again, matzah is min zraim, something that comes from a seed, a grain. Af mar min zraim. So to ultimately again, mar has to be from a seed item. As I just tell you as an aside, there's a beautiful statement by the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. The Baal Shem Tov says that by Mara, v'lo yuchlu lishtos mayim ki marim heim. They were unable to drink water, for the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. So the Baal Shem Tov says it shouldn't say ki marim heim, for they were bitter. Rather, it should say what? For it was bitter. The water was bitter. So the Baal Shem Tov says something so beautiful. He says that when it says they were bitter, the they wasn't a reference to the waters of Mara. It was a reference to Klal Yisrael. And the Baal Shem Tov said, when you are a bitter person, ultimately even the sweetest delicacies taste terrible. The problem with Klal Yisrael when they came to Mara is that they were not in a good place. They were not right of mind. They were not holding on the right madrega. Ki marim heim, they were bitter. And because they were bitter, ultimately again, the waters tasted bitter as well. And I will say such an incredible yisod, because so often in life, where you are holding emotionally and where you are holding spiritually colors everything you see, colors your interaction. Sometimes I'm having a difficult time with people, and it's easy to go ahead and say, this one's difficult, this one's difficult, this one's difficult. But sometimes a person has to look inward. Sometimes a person's having shalom bayis problems. Sometimes a person's having issues with their children, issues with their co-workers, or just in general, like whenever I look around at life, I just always see the glass half empty. So it's easy to always blame others, and it's easy to always blame circumstances. But sometimes the reality is kimarim haim. Sometimes really the problem in life is me. And if I would just adjust my attitude, work on myself, refine my midos, lift myself up, infuse into myself a little bit of personalistic sweetness, then perhaps the world and those who inhabit it would look a little bit sweeter. Incredible Yisor of the Baal Shem Tov. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Ve'ima here zifu. So ultimately, maybe it's here zifu. So Rashi says over here, Min zera v'sam hamavas lebehemos. We'll say this is an interesting suggestion. Maybe you should use here zifu. So apparently here zifu is a type of seed and it's poisonous for animals. But I guess it's not poisonous for people, right? Being bepashtos. So let's go ahead and use this poisonous seed for animals for maror. To which the Gemara says again, Dumya de matzah. Ma matzah shenikachas bekasef meiser, af maror shenikach bekasef meiser. To which the Gemara says, same idea. It's the matzah maror linkage. Just like matzah ultimately again has to be something that you could purchase, with meiser sheni money. So tomorrow has to be something that could be purchased with Meiser Sheni money. And apparently, again, this here zifu would be too insignificant in order to use Meiser Sheni money for it. Amrli Rabba Barbar, Chana Amra La'abaye. Eimor Maror Chad. How do you know that there's a whole list of items usable for maror? Maybe there's only one type of item usable for maror. Right? In other words, the Mishnah gives me a whole list. How do I use a whole list? Maybe just there's only one type of item usable for maror. To which the Gemara says, Merorim ksiv. Because halacha l'maisa, the Torah says, Lashon merorim, which is plural. I ve'ema merorim trey. It's fine, so maybe there are two items you use for maror. Dumya de matzah. Ma matzah meaning harbe, af maror meaning harbe. Because I will say there's once again the linkage between matzah and maror. Just like matzah could come from many different types of items, as you saw in the previous Mishnah, so too maror could come from many types of items as well. Amarav Barafuna Amarav. Yirakos sha'adam amru yotze, Yirakos sha'amru chachamim sha'adam yotze ba'yindei chavasa ba'pesach. So we'll say an interesting halacha now. So Rabbi Rav Huna says as follows in the name of Rav. These vegetables, which Chazal said you could use for maror, you could discharge your obligation for maror, kulan nizra'in ba'aruga achos. They could all be planted in the same row in a garden. Okay? Which sounds like what the Gemara is saying. Lememra de lespul mishum kilayim. Then I will say what that sounds like is that they have no problem of kilayim. So I'll say because ultimately, again, they're all grouped together in the same maror vegetable family, therefore there's no problem of intermingling species, and they could all be planted in the same row in a garden. So the Gemara says, L'meimer desel mishum galayim, massive Rava. So Rava says, 1 second, that's not true. Chazares v'chazares golin. So we'll say if you have chazares and chazares golin. So we'll say that's just two different types of chazares. Or ulshin v'ulshe sadeh. So we'll say, right, ulshin, which we translated before as endives. You have regular endives and field endives. Krishin ukrishe sadeh. So we'll say krishin are leeks. You have leeks and field leeks. Kusbar, the kusbar sadar. Kusbar is coriander. You have regular coriander and field coriander. Chardal, the chardal mitzri. Or you have mustard, regular mustard or Egyptian mustard. Udalaas hamitzri, the haramutza. So the Gemara says, Inam kilayim zebazeh. These items are not kilayim when planted with each other. Now I will say, the way the Gemara understands this is as follows. If you notice, these items were mentioned in pairs. So when the Brisa says that they're not kilayim, bepashtos, what that means is chazaris vechazaris golin in, chazaris ve'ulshin lo. So we'll say what that sounds like is, remember that, for example, the two like items aren't kilayim. So for example, the two types of chazares, or the two types of ulshin, or the two types of chardal, those items are not kilayim with each other. But if you were to go ahead and take one item from different pairs and plant them together, that potentially could be kilayim. But maybe you'll see, no, maybe halacha l'maisa. They're all mentioned together. Because they're all mentioned together, Therefore, maybe the brisa literally means to say you can mamish actually plant all of them together. V'amarav zugos katani. Rather, Rav says, no. They're purposely mentioned pair by pair to teach you that within each pair, there is no kilayim. But if you try to plant one pair, an item from one pair with an item from another pair, that actually will be problematic als kilayim. So my nizran, what does it mean when it says that they could be planted? The amarav nizran kil chasan. So what it means is they can be planted, but they must be planted in accordance with halacha. Rashi says over here, last Rashi on the daf, nizran kil chasan. Ka'amar kidei shelo yinaku zemizeh kigon chamisha zran b'ragu. So we'll say, so again, the idea is they can be planted, but halacha l'maisa, they must be planted with enough distance from one another that halacha l'maisa, they do not pose a halachic issue. Okay, so the Gemara says, kil chasan tanina. But I will say that's what you're coming to teach us over here, that if you have dissimilar items, you could plant them in the same garden together, as long as you plant that, as long as you space them sufficiently. We learned that concept already. Amud Beis, aruga shishi shal shisha tfachim. If, for example, you have a vegetable patch that is 6 tfachim by 6 tfachim, zorin besocha chamisha zironin, you could plant up to 5 different species within that patch. Arbal abaruchos, one species on each side of the perimeter of the patch, v'achas be'emsa, and ultimately again another species in the middle. So I'm going to say that would give you enough space to go ahead and distance each item from the other. So what exactly are we coming to learn over here? So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Hani mili bizarin. You might have thought that this is only with seeds. Aval birakaslo, but not with vegetables. Kamashmalan, that's not the case. To which the Gemara says, Lemeimra, dirakas alima mizraim. Are you trying to tell me, therefore, that again, that for some reason, halacha l'maisa, vegetables, right? That vegetables draw more nutrients from the soil than seeds, to the point that you might have thought that even with distance, you can't plant different types of vegetables within the same garden patch together. Tzvahatanan, we learned, kol minei ziraim ein zorin ba'aruga achos. You cannot go ahead and plant a variety of different seeds together in the same row. So the Gemara says, kol minei yirakos zorin ba'aruga achos. But different vegetables you can plant in the same row. So we'll say, which seems to indicate to us that halacha l'maisa, vegetables actually draw less nutrients from the soil than seeds. So ma'adatema, what would you have thought? Hani marar min zra'im ninhu. You might have thought that maybe marar itself, these vegetables from marar, maybe they have the status of min zra'im. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, that they have the status of yurakos and not the status of zuraim. Zuraim sakadaitcha. Why would you think that the marar vegetables would have the status of zuraim? At the end of the day, v'hatnan yirakos. Ultimately, again, remember our Mishnah when listing these items refers to them as vegetables. V'tani bar kafra yirakos. V'tani de beishmuel yirakos. To which the Gemara said, everyone calls it yirakos. Why would you have a havamina that you would call it zuraim by kloya kerem? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Chazaris, it's strichalei. It's dafka the case of chazares, lettuce, that poses a little bit of an issue. Sagadai tchamina, because I would have thought hoil v'sofa lahakshos neisiv le'revacha tfei, because I would have thought that since at the end of the day lettuce is destined to harden, as we discussed, neisiv le'revacha tfei. So I'll say, so it's interesting. Apparently, the fact that it hardens indicates that it soaks up more nutrients from the soil. Therefore, I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, perhaps lettuce has to be given more distance from other items, right, when planting them together in the same vegetable patch, than other types of vegetables. To which the Gemara says, Lav Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, Klach shal kruv shehuksha marchiven lo beis rova. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that if you have a stalk of cabbage that hardened, you have to go ahead and distance it a base rova from the nearest other plant. Alma kevan de sofa lahakshos yavina le'rafcha. Therefore, since it's going to harden, halacha l'maisa, we give it more space than other normal plants. To which the Gemara says, "Halacha nami nesav le'rafcha tfei." Therefore, so too over here, when planting in the vegetable patch, perhaps you should have to give it additional space. Kamash malon that you don't have to. Kamash malan, that even the lettuce, which is going to harden, halacha l'mais is treated like every other vegetable. Okay, good. So we'll say the Gemara just sprinkles in a little klaya kerem. Let's finish off the sugya. So yotzin bahen bein belachin bein yeveshin. So remember again, the Mishnah said you could use maror, the types of maror outlined in the Mishnah. You could use it whether the leaves are moist or whether the leaves are dry. Amrav Chista, lo shanu ela bekelach. That's only true with the stalk. Aval ba'alin, but if you want to use the leaves of these maror items, the halacha is lochin in yeveshin lo. It only works to use the leaves if they are moist, but not to use the leaves if they are dry. Because apparently, again, once the leaves dry out, they don't really have their taste anymore. So the stalk you could use moist or you could use dry, but the leaves themselves can only be used moist. But yet again the Seifa said that you could use the stalk. The Seifa of the Mishnah said you could even use the stalk. Mechlal dereisha olin. It sounds like I will say the Reisha of the Mishnah that said ben lachin ben yeveshin was talking about the leaves, not talking about the stalks, and it sounds like you could be able to use the leaves even if they are dry, to which the Gemara says, Perushe kamefarish. In reality, the Mishnah, the latter part of the Mishnah is actually coming to explain the earlier part of the Mishnah. Ki katani ben lachin ben yeveshin. When do we say that you could use a part of the lettuce or a part of the maror, whether it's moist or whether it's dry, a kalach? That refers to the stalk. So we'll say, based on where the Gemara is holding right now, you can use the stalk whether the stalk is moist or whether the stalk is dry. But halacha l'maisa, if you want to use the leaves themselves can only be used when moist, cannot be used when dry. Meisvei, so zakasha, yotzin bahen ubakalach shalahen, bein lachin ben yeveshin derei meir. So a meir holds that halacha l'maisa, you could be yotze with them, we'll see what this means, with them and with their stalk, whether it is moist or whether it is dry. These are words Rabbi Meir. The Chum say, lachin yotzin bahen, yeveshin ein yotzin bahen. The Chum say no, you could only use the leaves, well you could only use them, we'll define, if they are moist, but not if they are dry. V'shavin, sheyotzin bahen kemushin, avalo kevushin, velo shlukin, and everyone agrees that what? You can go ahead and be yotze with these types of maror, even if they are kemushin. I will say kemushin means withered. So even if it's withered, you can go ahead and use it, but not kevushin. Or as I will say, if it's been pickled or preserved, that you can't use. Velo shlukin, if it's been soaked. Velo mevushalin, nor can you use it if it's been cooked. So if it's been processed in any way, you can't use it. If it's just withered, ultimately, again, that is permitted. Klalo shal davar. Both say first wide line. Lamed testimony base. Here's a general rule. Kol sheyesh bo tam mar yotzin bo, v'chol she'ein bo tam mar ein yotzin bo. So we'll say bottom line, anything that has the taste of maror, you can use. And if it doesn't have the taste of maror, you can't use it. We'll say, but again, it appears to be from here that halacha l'maisa, even the leaves can be used, whether they are moist or whether they are dry. To which the Gemara says, tirgama akalach. Go ahead and explain that is referring ultimately again to the stalk. The stalk itself can be used whether it's moist or whether it's dry, but the leaves themselves ultimately again must be moist. Now it could be that they could be a bit withered, but halacha l'maisa they must still be moist. Tan Rabbanan, en yotzin ban kemushin. You can't go ahead, and the Brisa says over here, you can't use withered maror. And ultimately, again, the name of Rabbi Tzadok said, no, you can go ahead and use the leaves when they are withered. So the Gemara says, Boy Rami Bar Chama. So we'll say, what about the following? What about the following halacha? Or what about the following question? So we'll say, we'll see what to do about withered maror in just a moment. So Boy Rami Bar Chama, Maushi Yetze Adam Yedei Chavasa B'Mar Shemaiser Sheni B'Yerushalayim. So we'll say, back to our Meiser Sheni discussions like we had by Matzah. Can you use maror of Meiser Sheni for maror? So we'll say, so remember again, a person, let's say, has a lettuce of Meiser Sheni lettuce. I bring it to Yerushalayim for Pesach. Can I go ahead, it's mine, I could eat it, right? Can I go ahead and use that maror to satisfy my obligation on Pesach? To which the Gemara says, Alibud Rabbi Akiva lo tibari lecha. So according to Rabbi Akiva, it's not a shayla. Why not? Hashta b'matzah doraisa nafik b'mar drabanan mibai. So remember again, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that you could even use meiser sheni matzah. If you could use meiser sheni matzah, and matzah is a mitzvah da'oraisa, so of course you could use meiser sheni maror, which is only dirabanan. Kiti ba'ilachas. So we'll say, where does the shayla come up? Ali b'd Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. Comes up on Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. Mai. So we'll say, what would Rabbi Yossi HaGalili say? Mai. B'matzah da'oraisa d'lo nafik, aval mar dirabanan nafik. So is it, remember again, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, remember again, his problem, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili's problem was lechem oni, right? His issue ultimately, again, was the fact that it has to be something that is consumable chomo shoseichem in all situations, and meiser sheni is not consumable in a state of aninos, in a state of avelos. So what's the halacha? So do we say that according to Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, it's only matzah da'oraisa, which cannot be used for meiser sheni, but mar drabanan can? O dilma kol de dakina rabanan kein da'oraisa tikun. Or maybe we'll say that halacha l'maisa, whenever Chazal legislated halacha, they legislated halacha like a da'oraisa. So therefore, if matzah da'oraisa is not usable for meiser sheni, mar drabanan will not be usable either. To which the Gemara says, Amarava mistabra matzah umaror. Ultimately, as Rava says, it would appear that we link matzah and maror together. And therefore, again, just as Rabbi Yossi HaGalili does not allow for the use of meiser sheni matzah, he also will not allow for the use of meiser sheni maror. So I will say, this concludes the sugya of maror. Let me share with you just some interesting halacha l'maisa. So I sent out a copy of the Shulchan Aruch in the WhatsApp chat, literally right before the shir. So if you want to follow along, you can. If not, I'll tell you. So we'll say. So I'm just going to read to you one halacha. This is from Siman Taf Ayin Gimel Sif Hey. Taf Ayin Gimel Sif Hey. So we'll say a really incredible halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows: Elu yirakos sheyotze bohem yedei chavaso. These are the vegetables that one could use to fulfill their obligation of maror on Pesach. Chazeres, Olshin, Tamcha, Charchavina. He says, Perish, Mine Asavim, Marim, and Mara. So again, I will say, if you notice again, the Ramah, in his comment on this, says that Halacha L'maisa, these are just different types of Mara. So we'll say, we'll finish up first the Mechaber, then I'll show you the Mishnah. Well, let me show you the Mishnah Berurah for just a moment. So we'll say, if you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, Sif Katan Lamed Dalid. So the Mishnah Berurah says, Perish mine marem asavim lamed dalid akulu kai umishum de shein yon anu yodin beberer ezaheim bil shonenu. So why is the Ramah adding in this phrase that these are different types, these are different bitter vegetables? So the Mishnah Berurah comments, that's because we are not clear exactly what types of items these are. In other words, that the exact definition of many of these items actually escapes us. Lekach kasav b'derech klal akulhu shem minim marim. V'kasu achronim shetamcha huchrein. So we'll say, so it's interesting. So the Mishnah Berurah says over here that halacha l'maisa tamcha chrein. Now we'll say, if you look in the additional Mishnah Berurah I sent you, so on the bottom he has a line here, the Targum translate chrein as chazeres. So we'll say, this is what I mentioned before, the terms get a little bit confusing. So chazeres in this context means horseradish, but it's the white horseradish root. It's the white horseradish root. So tamcha, so we'll say, so again, so just to point out, so remember, just so you see this, so remember, tamcha was item number 2 in the Mishnah. So item number 1 was chazeres, which we'll define in just a moment. Item number 2 is tamcha, which is horseradish. So bilshayin aval chazeres chasav achok Yaakov v'chein chacham tzvi shumash anu korin shalatin, which again chasa, lettuce. So the Mishnah Berurah himself already says, by the way, chazeres is lettuce, tamcha is chrein. Tamcha is horseradish. So we'll say, so take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Lamed Vav. Actually, before we get to that, well, let me just say this very quickly. So look at Lamed Vav. Even though Perish Rashim Kitanim Amitzav, he goes on. He says, "V'hine b'medina seinu ein shar haminim mitzuyim Al kein morer hanog b'medinasinu hu le'achol tamcha v'hu chrein. Suppose say this is very interesting. So the Mishnah Berurah says, suppose say, here's what's interesting, is the use of horseradish has become, I think its thing is less now, but I think very often it was assumed that people used horseradish, chrein, for maror, which is quite intriguing given the fact that it's the number 2 item on the list, not number 1, and that the order is important. So the Rebbe says there's a very simple reason for it. So apparently the Mishnah Berurah says it explicitly. He says that's because chrein is what they had. That's what they had. That was much more readily available than lettuce. So even though, again, lettuce is the preferred item, nevertheless, chrein became popularized in its usage because it was available. Al-kin amar hanag b'medinasinu le'achol tamcha, Sukri writes, he says, v'yesh li zar shelo le'achol also kishehu shalem. So the Mishnah Berurah says, but you have to be very careful not to eat chrein whole. Shekimat hu sakana ve'in bo mitzvah. Mishnah Berurah writes, this is great, right? There's always that uncle at the Seder, right, who thinks that somehow chrein consumption is like a test of Jewish masculinity, right, and consumes a chunk of chrein, turns beet red, can't breathe, and tries to convince everyone that no, he's really okay, right? So the Mishnah Berurah says that, by the way, please don't do that, because that's sakana. He says, ve'in bo mitzvah. He says there's no mitzvah in putting yourself b'derech sakana from Mitzvah D'Rabbanan. Shemachmas charifuso hu mazik gadol v'lachin tzarich lefararo al ribaizin. He says therefore you have to grind it up. He says you have to grind it up. We don't eat maror whole. If you're going to use chrein, you have to use chrein that's ground. Now again, I will say obviously he doesn't mean the chrein like you purchase for your gefilte fish. That's not, because that's processed, that has additives in it, but it means if you take the horseradish root, you grind it up. Now listen to this. He says, V'hagra hinig shelo lefara osa kodem b'yosu beis hakneses kedei shelo yafig hatam. The gra was makbid to only grind up his chrein when he got home from shul. So not to grind it up too early, because if you grind it up too early, then halacha l'maisa, that could be a problem that it loses its bitterness. But to go and grind it up, good. So we'll say, so just for another minute, just to continue on in the Shulchan Aruch. So we'll say, so here you have the Mishnah Berurah. So number 1, telling us that we actually don't know the definition of a lot of these items. Halacha l'maisa again, however, the order is specific. So the ideal item to be used for maror is lettuce. The only reason why chrein became so popular was because that's what they had access to. If using chrein, be careful. Go back to the top of the Shulchan Aruch. V'yotzin ba'alin shalahem o bekalchan. Avalo b'shoresh. So we'll say halacha l'maisa from the maror plant. You could use the leaves, you could use the stalk, but not the roots. Now the Mishnah Berurah points out when he says not the roots, that's referring to like the little thin roots that come out of the plant. Those can't be used. So we'll say, so remember again, if you want to use the leaves, you could use them, but they must be moist. So an incredibly important halacha. Have to use moist leaves. So we'll say, so again, this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. So halacha l'maisa, leaves can be used, but only if moist. Stalk can be used, whether it's moist or whether it's dry. But however, avalo kivushim, velo shalukim, velo mevushalan. You can't use it if it's pickled or preserved, if it's soaked or if it's cooked. The kula mitzdarfan lekizayis. Ultimately, again, all of them combine to form a kizayis or a shir lahem. Ve ha'ikar ha'mitzvah bechazeres. Shulchan Aruch paskins. The ikar mitzvah for maror is to use lettuce. We'll say if you can't find lettuce, then ultimately, again, says the Shulchan Aruch, go down the list of the Mishnah, and obviously, again, the higher the item on the list, the more preferred it is for the performance of the mitzvah. All right, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up at the new Mishnah tomorrow.